A quiet mind begins to believe its darkest thoughts are truth, until one small moment reveals the control was never real, only carefully repeated illusions. The room was quiet. Not completely silent, but quiet in a way that made every small sound feel louder than it should. A soft ticking clock, a faint hum from outside, the slow movement of air through a slightly open window. The figure sat near the edge of a bed. Nothing about the room looked unusual. The walls were plain. A soft light came in from the side, pale and distant, like it had traveled a long way just to reach the floor. A chair stood in the corner, untouched. A cup rested on a table, half full, long forgotten. Everything was normal, but something felt off. The figure looked down at their hands. Still, quiet, no movement, just resting there. And yet, inside, something wouldn't stop moving. A thought appeared. Small, almost unnoticeable. Something feels wrong. It didn't come with a loud voice. It didn't demand attention. It just existed, like a shadow passing quietly across the mind. The figure didn't question it. Why would they? It felt real. A few seconds passed. Then another thought followed. Maybe something is wrong. This one stayed a little longer. The figure shifted slightly, adjusting their posture, as if trying to settle into something more comfortable. But the feeling didn't change. The light in the room seemed a little dimmer now. Or maybe it was always like that. More thoughts came, slowly building. Did I forget something? Did I do something wrong? Why does this feel so heavy? Each thought connected to the next, forming a quiet chain. There was no clear reason. No clear event. Nothing had happened. But inside, it felt like something had. The figure stood up and walked slowly across the room. The floor felt steady beneath their feet, but their mind didn't feel steady at all. They stopped near the window. Outside, the world moved normally. People passed by in the distance. Light reflected off surfaces. Somewhere far away, something made a soft sound that couldn't quite be identified. Everything outside seemed fine. But inside, the thoughts continued. You should feel better than this. Why can't you just feel normal? Something isn't right with you. The figure looked at their reflection in the window. It wasn't clear, just a faint outline shaped by the light behind them. For a moment they stared at it, trying to understand something they couldn't explain. The thoughts didn't stop. They never really did. Later, the figure sat down again. Same place. Same position. But something had changed. Not in the room. In the feeling. The weight was heavier now. Not because something new had happened, but because the same thoughts had repeated, over and over. Each time, they felt more believable, more real. The figure leaned forward slightly, resting their elbows on their knees, breathing slowly, listening. Inside, there was a constant quiet noise. Not loud, not sharp, just steady, like a background sound that never turned off. This isn't going to change. You always feel like this. You can't fix this. The words didn't feel like thoughts anymore. They felt like truth. That was the part the figure didn't notice. The shift was small, almost invisible. At some point, the mind had stopped questioning and started accepting. Time passed, though it didn't feel like it was moving. The light in the room changed slightly, becoming softer, more faded. Shadows stretched longer across the floor. The figure hadn't moved much. There didn't seem to be a reason to. Every action felt heavier than it should. Even simple things. Standing up, reaching for something, looking around. All of it felt like it required more effort than usual. The thoughts continued to fill the space. Not aggressively, not loudly, just consistently. What's the point? Nothing really changes. You're stuck like this. The figure closed their eyes for a moment. Just a moment. But even there, the thoughts followed. There was no escape from them. Not in silence. Not in stillness. Not even in rest. That's when something else began to change. The figure started noticing less of the world around them. The room faded into the background. Details became less important. The chair in the corner didn't matter. The light didn't matter. Even the quiet sounds that once felt noticeable began to disappear. Everything outside became distant, and everything inside became louder. The mind had taken center stage, and it didn't give space to anything else. The figure slowly lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. It was plain, empty, still, but the mind wasn't. The thoughts continued to loop. Not new thoughts, the same ones. Again and again. Each repetition made them stronger, more convincing, more permanent. It didn't feel like thinking anymore. It felt like remembering something that had always been true. The figure didn't realize what was happening. They didn't see the pattern. They didn't notice the repetition. All they felt was the result. A quiet, steady belief forming underneath everything. This is just how it is. The room grew darker as time passed. The light faded slowly, leaving behind soft shadows that blended into the walls. The figure remained still, eyes open, breathing calm but heavy. The world outside continued, unchanged. But inside, something had shifted deeply. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just slowly enough to go unnoticed. The thoughts were no longer separate. They had become part of the background, part of the identity, part of the way the figure saw everything. And that was the quietest change of all. Because it didn't feel like change. It felt like truth. The room was still. That something in it had shifted. Not in a way that could be seen immediately. The walls were the same. The chair still stood in the corner. The faint light had almost disappeared, leaving behind a soft grey stillness. The figure lay on the bed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The thoughts were still there. They hadn't left. This is just how it is. Nothing will change. You'll always feel this way. They moved slowly, repeating in the same quiet rhythm. But this time, something small happened. Something so small it almost didn't matter. A pause. Between one thought and the next, there was a space. Just a brief, quiet gap. The figure didn't plan it. They didn't try to create it. It simply appeared. For a moment there was no voice, no sentence, no weight, just stillness. The figure blinked. It felt different. Not better. Not worse, just different. Then the next thought came again. But this time, something unusual followed it. A quiet question. Am I? The figure didn't move, but something inside them did. That question didn't feel like the others. It didn't carry the same heaviness. It didn't push down. It didn't demand belief. It simply existed. And for the first time, the thought that came before it didn't feel completely solid. Not physically, but in a way that was hard to explain. Like there was more space inside it. Another thought appeared. Nothing will change. The figure noticed it. Not just the meaning of it, but the way it arrived. Quietly, automatically, almost like it had been following a script. And then again, the question came. Is that true? There was no answer. But something important had already happened. The thought had been seen. Not accepted. Not rejected. Just noticed. The figure slowly sat up. The movement felt different this time. Not lighter, exactly, but not as heavy either. For the first time in a while, they actually looked. The chair in the corner, the table, the half-full cup. None of it had changed. But it no longer felt as distant. The world hadn't disappeared. It had just been covered. Covered by something quiet, repetitive, and constant. The figure stood up and walked toward the window again. Outside, the same world moved as before. People passing, light reflecting. Small movements blending into one continuous flow. But now, something felt slightly clearer. Not brighter. Just clearer. Another thought appeared. You don't belong out there. The figure paused. They didn't push the thought away. They didn't argue with it. They just noticed it. And as they did, something unexpected happened. The thought didn't grow. It didn't expand into more thoughts. It didn't pull them deeper. It just stayed there for a moment, and then faded. The figure blinked again. That had never happened before. A chain, a loop, a pattern that never stopped. But this time, the chain had broken. Not completely, but enough to notice. The air felt different against their skin. Cooler, lighter, or maybe they were just noticing it for the first time. Inside, the thoughts continued to appear. They didn't stop. You'll go back to how you were. This won't last. You can't change this. But now, something had changed in the way they were received. Each thought was seen, like watching clouds pass in the sky. They came. They existed. And then, they moved on. Not all of them faded quickly. Some stayed longer. Some still felt heavy. But they didn't feel absolute anymore. They didn't feel like facts. The figure stepped back from the window and looked around the room again. It was the same room. Nothing had been fixed. Nothing had been replaced. And yet, it didn't feel as closed as before. The space felt open. Not because the room had changed, but because something inside had. The figure walked slowly across the room. Each step felt more real. More connected, not forced, not heavy, just happening. Another thought appeared. What if this comes back? The figure paused. That one felt familiar. It carried a quiet fear, a soft tension. But again, instead of sinking into it, they noticed it. And then, something else followed. Not a strong voice, not a loud realization. Just a quiet understanding. It might. There was no resistance in that answer. No panic. No urgency. Just acceptance. And strangely, that made the thought feel smaller. Less threatening. Because it was no longer something to fight. It was just something that could happen. And if it did, it could be noticed again. The figure sat back down on the edge of the bed. Same place as before. Same position, but a completely different feeling. The room was still quiet. The clock still ticked softly. The faint hum still existed somewhere in the distance. Nothing outside had changed, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt neutral, peaceful in a quiet way. The thoughts still came. They didn't disappear completely, but they no longer controlled everything. They no longer shaped every feeling. They were just part of the background now, not the center. The figure looked down at their hands again. Still, resting, calm. But this time, there was no search for something wrong. No quiet panic hiding underneath. Just observation. Just presence. And in that moment, something became clear. Not in words. Not in a sentence, but in a feeling. The control had never really belonged to the thoughts. It had only felt that way because they were repeated. Over and over, until they sounded like truth. But they were never truth. Just patterns. Just habits. Just quiet loops that had gone unnoticed for too long. The figure took a slow breath. The air felt steady, real, grounded. Outside, the world continued to move. Inside, the mind continued to think. But now there was space between the two. And in that space, there was choice. Not loud, Not dramatic, just quiet and steady. The kind of control that doesn't force anything. It simply allows. The room remained the same, but it no longer felt like a place of weight. It felt like a place of awareness, and that changed everything.